special meeting
Hold on,
today.
Tarek. Hold on just 1 second. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome everybody on the panel and on Thawra TV. We are today talking about the U.S. post-U.S. election. We're going to have Paula Yacoubian from Beirut. Paula, I would like to call her Paul. Lots of people like to call her lots of things, but today she is with us because she's a mother, she's a woman. Thawra in Lebanon is about students and about the woman. We want to see the, 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 the way U.S. and the women in the U.S. become to the highest position, to become the first woman vice president, and so many new things happen in the U.S. market with like U.S. election. Sorry, and we would like to learn from that and see how we can implement this here in Lebanon. I would like to welcome Jim Clancy as well with us. Jim Clancy is a friend for the family, and you guys all know him. And we did with him a Zoom meeting before the election, and he was right on lots of things. We're gonna discuss this later, and we're gonna have Wissam Yafi, the author of Bill of Rights, from DC as well, to talk about the U.S. election. And Dina from Ana Al-Qarar. Lots of people know her voice, but doesn't know her in person. She's gonna be live with us today. And we're going to discuss about the U.S. election. I will, Paula, hi, how are you? And welcome to Thawra TV. And I have very two good experience with you personally. I would like to thank you for the first 500 followers on YouTube, you guys. You put the post and you told your followers to subscribe to Thawra TV, and my mom told me to call you and say thank you. Second one, I remember very well when we had a problem, not a problem, there was a woman, she needed help, and you were with us on the chat, and you helped her, and this is, I think, one of the best things we did for Thawra TV. We would love you for being with us, especially today with what's happening in the women's world, and we'd like to welcome you to Thawra TV with us. And I would
Thank
give
you.
the Dina.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for everything, Paula. Dina, it's your floor. I did my introduction.
Very happy you are with us. رح قلت عربي انجليزي مثل ما اتفقنا باول بارت. بتعرفي نحن هلا بجو الانتخابات الامريكانيه بعدنا غاصين، وجو الدول الخارجيه اللي كانت عم تتدخل بتجرب تساعد لبنان. فاليوم انا سؤالي لك كنبلش، كونك بعتبر انا وبدي حييكي قبل اول شيء كمرأة كأنثى فيميل، ونحن بنقول الثورة أنثى بكل فخر. بدي حييك اليوم معنا واشكرك على كل شيء عم تعمليه، كل المساعدات والمهمات الصعبة اللي عم تقومي فيها بكل المراحل اللي مرقنا فيها واللي شفناها بالزبالة، بمساعدات الشباب، واخيرا ببعض انفجار حرب عقاب. نحن بنفتخر فيك بولا، ونعتقد انه انت ركن اساسي من اركان الثورة. اهلا وسهلا فيك.
تسلمي، شكرا.
أول سؤال لك اليوم، بحبوا أسأل بالإنجليزي أو بالعربي؟
أنا أكيد بفضل العربي، بس رح أعمل مثلك، رح جرب. I will try to speak in English for Jim at least. I think everyone else understands Arabic. I have the handicap of the language, Jim, so I hope you excuse me if I have to express myself in Arabic sometimes. So, but I think we're on the same wavelength, both of us.
اوكي، اول سؤال لك بسالك، كيف بتترجم الانتخابات الامريكيه من المنظار اللبناني؟ How do you translate the US election from a local Lebanese perspective? Did it meet expectations? Are there any fears now that Biden has been elected? في شي مخاوف اليوم وقت انتخب بايدن؟ اللبنانيه خايفين من شيء؟ اللبنانيه حطوا امال كبيره على ترامب.
في جزء دينا من اللبنانية حط أمال على ترامب، في جزء كتير كبير حطت أمال على بايدن. وأنا بعتقد اللي كتير متأمل بأي شيء خارج الحدود اللبنانية رح ينصاب بالخيبة ورح يشعر بالإحباط لاحقاً. الدول بكل العالم، الدول مصالح ونفوذ، والدول ما عندها أصدقاء، والدول عندها أجندات تنطلق هالأجندات من مصالحها، من مصالح شعبها ونفوذها اقتصادها، والعالم كله هو ساحة ومسرح مين بجمع وراء أكثر، مين بيقوي موقعه على الخريطة العالمية. نحن كلبنانيين عانينا من تدخل الدول الخارجية بلبنان، إن كانت أمريكا وإن كانت إيران وإن كانت السعودية وإن كانت فرنسا وإن كان العالم كله. ما في شك في جزء من الدول ساعدونا. بنفس الوقت وقتها كان في عندهم تقاطع مصالح معينة، عملوا مصالحهم بغض النظر عن مصلحة اللبنانيين، وكتير أصيبوا بالإحباط إنه هي على أساس هول أصحابنا. ما في أصحاب بالعلاقات الدولية، وما في أصدقاء بالعلاقات الدولية، في إنه بلد بيكون محصل حاله بيعمل مصالحه. فأنا للبنانيين اللي مبسوطين ببايدن وللي زعلانين ليش خسر ترامب، ما بعتقد رح يكون في فرق كتير كبير بسياسة الإدارة الأمريكية تجاه لبنان. ما بعتقد أبداً أي إدارة أمريكية رح ترجع كأنه ما خلص عهد أوباما، وكأنه بعد الإدارة مكملة بالاتفاق النووي الإيراني مثلاً. كل هيدي الأوهام بين هلالين، بعتقد أنه في واقع كتير جديد اليوم على الأرض مختلف. الواقع اللي أفرزته كل هيدي السنوات والسياسات من قبل الإدارة الجمهورية الأخيرة اللي هي 4 سنين، ما بيشبهوا أي شيء تاني، ما بيشبهوا حتى إدارات جمهورية سابقة. ترامب غير كتير بطريقة تعاطي الولايات المتحدة مع العالم، وبعتقد حتى الرؤساء الجمهوريين سابقا ما كتير ما بيشبهون ولا بيشبهوه. فأنت عندك رئيس مختلف بهال4 سنين. أنا بالنسبة لي على الصعيد الشخصي، لما تفكري عم بهرب من السؤال، أنا بقول لك لي خبر جيد وصول بايدن، مش سيء. ما بحط توقعات كبيرة ولا بحط أمال على أي إدارة، بس بعتقد بعد 4 سنين من بيجتري، من رئيس ديفايدر بيقسم الناس أسود ضد أبيض، لاجئ ضد مهاجر، مسيحي ضد مسلم، كان رئيس كتير بيقسم الناس. بدك اليوم حدا بيرجع يجمع الأمريكيين أكيد، ويرجع يجمع العالم، يرجع يرقع التحالفات بالترانس أتلانتيك، يرجع يعود فيه هيك إنسانية أكثر، شوي أكثر ولو بالشكل، بالسياسات الخارجية. وأنا أكيد كتير انبسطت بنائبة الرئيس. هيدا لإلي بتمنى يكون هيدا المسار disruptive، يغير بطريقة الانتخاب، بالناس كيف بتطلع. لما تحط الرجل الأبيض الأشقر العيون الزرق بالبيت الأبيض، هيدا بيكون له تأثير وترددات بالعالم كله. لما بتجيب diversity ولما بتجيب اختلاف أكتر، كمان هيدا بيكون له ترددات بالعالم. الريبل إفكت لوجود شخص مثل كاملا هاريس بالبيت الأبيض، بعتقد رح يكون good news للعالم كله، رح يكون خبر جيد للعالم كله. وإن شاء الله نكون ما نعيش، خلينا نقول شيء مختلف. كل هالسنة ما شفنا ولا خبر حلو، فبتمنى إنه يعني يكون بايدن هو فاتحة سنة جديدة وأحداث مختلفة. واليوم كان في الفاكسين تبع فايزر كمان، فبركي عم تبلش الأمور الإيجابية تبين.
يعني حلو، عم بسمع منك هيك لمح، يعني امل معين بفرفح القلب بصراحه. وبفهم انه يعني ما كثير رح يتاثر لبنان بين ترامب والبايدن، بس انه شايفين امل. وخصوصا انا كنت واصله هالسؤال لك وانت حكيتي عنه، بالنسبه لك شو شعورك كسيده اليوم؟ شو حسيتي وقتها شفتي كامالا هاريس انتخبت؟
هلا الخبر الاحلى شيء بيكون بلبنان دينا انه نسمع بتجمع كبير للمعارضه ضمن جبهه واحده، يشتغلوا مع بعض، يجهزوا مشروع ويفرجوا فريق عمل في مواجهه المافيا اللبنانيه الحاكمه. بس اكيد خبر كتير حلو اليوم انه سيده امها وبيها مهاجرين الى الولايات المتحده، بي افريقي وام هنديه. احلى بالنسبه لي مش بس انها هي سيده ذات لون او سيده من اقليه، سيده من جايه من خلفيه مختلفه عن السائد، هي ايضا بنت اكتيفيست. امها كانت ناشطه وبيها كان ناشط، وهيدا الاضافه اضافه الى الاشياء الثانيه بهويتها اللي هي ما لها علاقه فيهم. خلقت ببيت هيك. بس زيادة إنه هذا البيت كانوا عندهم دايما نشاط سياسي بالستينات وبالسبعينات، وكان عندهم مشاركات ومساهمات مهمة على صعيد عدالة أكبر، على صعيد إنسانية واحدة. بالنسبة لي بقول لك إنه وضع المرأة بلبنان كلنا بنعرف كيف بتتعرض، خاصة المرأة بالسياسة بتتعرض لنوع من الحملات لسمير كامبينز كثير أكثر من أي محل بالعالم. وهذا اللي بيصير بعد لليوم بأمريكا. بلبنان بدك تضربيها بقى بألف للأسف. فأي امرأة بموقع القرار، أي امرأة بدها تقاتل وبدها تستمر survivor and fighter مثل كاملا هاريس، هي امرأة رح تساعد وضعية المرأة أي مكان بالعالم، مش بس بالولايات المتحدة، خارج حدودها. أي امرأة تنتخب وبتعمل أداء مثل أنجيلا ميركل، مثل كتير سيدات كانوا علامة فارقة بالسياسة الدولية، بعتقد هن كمان بيأكدوا مرة جديدة إنه الموروثات، إنه بتعرفي المرأة للبيت والمطبخ فقط، والرجل للسياسة. المرأة ما فيها تعمل ماتيماتيك، مرأة لازم تروح على الشعر والفلسفة. كل هيدي الأفكار البالية عم بتصير بالية أكتر كل ما عم بيكون في a good example. and she is already a good example. يعني شفتها، تبعتها، سمعت سبيتش تبعها بعد ما أعلنوا ربحهم، كان كتير حلو، كتير ملهم. وإن شاء الله نحن كمجتمع بالداخل نكون كمان عم نحضر وعم نستلهم كيف نقدر نوقف حد بعض، نقدر نتخطى الإيجوز، نشتغل كفريق لوطن أفضل. نحن علينا كتير مسؤوليات من ثورة تي في، حابة أقولها، علينا مسؤوليات كأشخاص بلشنا بالمعارضة يمكن قبل ما يكون في ثورة وقبل ما الناس تكون بالشارع. علينا مسؤولية مضاعفة إنه نضل نحكي مع الجميع، نشبك مع الجميع، ندعيهم لوحدة أكبر، لتنسيق أوسع. لأن بالآخر ما حدا يفكر إنه البعض عنده هيك إحباط إنه وين الثورة وشو صار بالثوار، وتعرفي كيف يصيروا يتهمونا بسفرات وغيرها وكذا. اللي صار بالثورة بلبنان هي إنه المافيا جربت بكل الطرق والوسائل انها تضرب هذه الثوره، وضربوها عبر مندسين، ضربوها عبر العنف والتكسير، ضربوها عبر القواص مباشره على عيون الشباب اللي نزلت على الشارع، عبر 8 شهداء راحوا في سبيل هذا الوطن، عبر كل ذلك. وبعدين الانهيار والتجويع والتخويف والقلق. فاليوم لبنان هذا ما بيعني انه اللبنانيين استسلموا. اللبنانيين قاعدين ببيوتهم بعدهم هول، اذا مش ثوار معارضين، وهذا كتير مهم. علينا نقدر نشتغل كفريق باكثر تنسيق ممكن، نساعد الناس ونوقف حدها، ونفرجيهم انه نحن ما بنتخلى عنهم، ونحن ما بنستسلم، نحن بالعكس بنستمر لنعمل بلد افضل. الإدارة الأمريكية شو ما كانت، أنا بلاقي انعكاسها بالنسبة للبنان منه انعكاس أساسي، لأن عم تكبر القناعة أكثر وأكثر ما بين اللبنانيين يتكلوا على قواهم الذاتية. هن شعب واحد يفكر بمصلحته المشتركة. أنا ما بجي برفض التدخل الإيراني بلبنان وبطالب سند أمريكي لكي أواجه هذا التدخل. ما بيفرقوا عن بعض. نحن مضطرين كلبنانيين نصنع منعتنا الداخلية الذاتية. هيدا اللي أكتر شيء بيضر بفريق المافيا اليوم، إنه نكون لبنانيين. أكتر شيء بيكرهوا 17 تشرين لأنه تجمع خارج الاصطفافات اللي هن كرسوها، خارج الانقسامات اللي بتوافقهم. ما نزلوا لا زعيم شيعي ولا سني ولا درزي ولا مسيحي، نزلوا لبنانيين من كل الطوائف، من كل الطبقات، من كل المناطق، نزلوا بنفس الساحة يصرخوا بصوت عالي، فلوا كلكم يعني كلكم. فهول كلهم يعني كلهم، حتى اللي بيدعي حال انه هو مع المعارضة ومع مطالبها، كلهم كذابين. بخافوا اللبناني يكتشف مصلحته المشتركة، وبخافوا يشتغل كشعب واحد. قبل بالبيت الأبيض كان في حدا تقسيمي مثل ما قلنا، اليوم في أشخاص توحيديين. عم جرب شوف إذا ممكن ينقلوا هذا التقارب اللي بيحملوه والقيم اللي بيحملوها. يعني حتى بايدن، ما بدنا نحكي بس على الامرأة، بايدن شخص تاريخه مشرف، تصرفاته مشرفة، وضعه العائلي، مقاربته للسياسة كان فيها كثير من الأخلاقية. كاملا هاريس بموضوع الكلايمت تشينج، بعتقد انه ايه تشينج كثير كبير من ترامب ادمنستريشن لليوم، وهول مسائل بتهم الكره الارضيه كلها، بتهم كل انسان وكل شخص عم بيطلع لوضع ولا بلد افضل ولا مطرح افضل. بهيدي المسائل اللي انا بقول لك بتطلع عليه انه لا، في عنا امل اليوم انه يكون في شيء افضل ومختلف. بالنسبه للصراع مع اسرائيل، دينا نحن بنفس المطرح، ما بعتقد رح يكون في اختلاف. ترامب كرئيس عطى كل شيء بينعطى لإدارة نتنياهو بالذات، لحليفه نتنياهو أعطيه كل شيء معقول يعطيه، ما ترك شيء لأي رئيس أمريكي يجي من بعده يعطي شيء. وما بعتقد إنه بايدن حيروح يرجع ينقل السفارة من القدس يرجعها إلى تل أبيب، ما حدا منا بيعتقد إنه رح يعملوا شيء من هذا النوع. ففي ادفانتجز بكثير محلات بسياستهم الخارجيه اتليست اللي بين منها، وفي كمان محلات الامال اللي معلقه البعض انه في انقلاب. ما بعتقد رح يكون في انقلاب على صعيد دولي.
هون بزيد نقطتين على اللي بتقوله بولا. اكشلي واحده من النقط هو انه النساء انتخبوا بايدن. النساء they by an overpowering margin انتخبوا لبايدن. يعني النساء انتخبوا، خلينا نقول اذا الفايس بريزيدنت كانوا النساء ساعدوا بانتخاب اول مرأة فايس بريزيدنت. هذه نقطة ثانية هو ثاقبت هالسنة ال 100th anniversary of الحقوق المرأة بالانتخاب بالولايات المتحدة. So this was an important milestone. يعني بعد 100 سنة ما أعطوها حق الانتخاب للمرأة، طلعت مرأة one of the top two tickets بالولايات المتحدة. في شغلة ثالثة نقطة قالتها بولا which is interesting، هي اللي بيقولوا بيتمسخروا على الثورة بلبنان. من يومين لما صار اللي صار بأمريكا، الناس عم تحكي هون إنه حتى الثورة الأمريكية بعد 250 سنة is still alive، بعدها بتشعلي. يعني اللي مفكر إنه الثورة بتطلع بسنة وبتنطفي بعد سنة أو بعد 5 سنين، في ناس بأمريكا بعدهم لهلا بيحكوا إنه الثورة is still alive. يعني the revolution of 1776 بعدها كل سنة وكل 4 سنين وكل انتخاب بترجع بتبين نفسها، انه العالم بدهم تغيير. ب 1960 عملوا الثوره ليغيروا. هو ثوره تغيير، ثوره عقليه، ثوره از سبيريت، هي روح. فما يعني انتم بالثوره بقول لكم اياها، انا بعتبر حالي دفنت بالثوره. ما لازم حتى نضيع وقتنا باللي عم بيتساءل انه شو معنى الثوره وشو قررت الثوره وشو عملت الثوره وشو ما عملت الثوره. يفكروا كيف ما بدهم. نحن بنضلنا لقدام مثل ما هن في شعوب بعد 250 سنه لهلا بعدهم بثوراتهم وبعدهم وراء التغيير والتحسين بمجتمعاتهم، لانه التغيير ما بيوقف. هيدي سنه الحياه، بضل التغيير دائما لقدام. It's always going to be like this.
مزبوط. هي يعني بجد الثوره هي حاله نفسيه بنقول، نبضنا يمكن شوي رايقين هلا، بس هذا ما بيعني انه وقفنا وما رح نوقف. تلاحظنا لو اخذت وقت وبنعرف رح تاخذ وقت. حاله نفسيه نحن عايشينها كل يوم وكل لحظه ومكفيين. بولا، انت من اللي نادوا بالانتخابات المبكره عكس كم حدا غيرك. اليوم بدي اسالك، بعد ما تشوفي هالزخم كله بامريكا هالزخم اللي صار بالانتخابات وهالتغيير اللي صار نحن كنا بركي في عالم كانت منتظره شيء وطلع شيء ثاني، العالم انتخبت وتحمست بركي لانه بتعرف حقوقها. نحن اليوم شو وضعنا بدي اسالك مع المنظومه الحاليه؟ وين عندنا هالناس الشعب اللبناني اللي بعد المراه ما بتعرف حقوقها، والطفل ما بيعرف، مش الطفل نحن نقول اللي صار 20 و21 حتى ما بيعرف. يا هل ترى اليوم مع هالمنظومه اللي عندنا وصار في انتخابات، نحن بنقدر نوصل لانتخابات نيابيه عادله؟ وشو فينا نحن نعمل اليوم بخصوص هالحقوق اللي شفناها؟ كل واحد امريكاني بيتمتع وبيعرف، في عندهم اويرنس معينه عارفين يطالبوا. هذا الزخم ما اجى الا لانه هن بدهم كل واحد منهم حقوقه، بده يعيش محترم، بده يعيش انسان يعني بده حقوقه الانسانيه، يرفع راسه، يشتغل، يتعلم، ينام بتخت. نحن اليوم والمراه المقموعه بعض الفئات من اللبنانيه، نحن اليوم كيف بتشوفي دورنا وكيف فينا نوصل بوجود منظومه مثل اللي عنا نحقق انتصار معين وزخم بالانتخابات؟ ندعي الكل ينتخبوا؟ كيف فينا نشجع؟
دينا بدي أشكرك على السؤال اللي سألتي عن الانتخابات المبكرة. نعم، أنا بعتقد إنه كان عندنا مومنتم مهم جدا. في كثير من المجموعات كان عندهم خوف من مقاربة الانتخابات، وكانوا معتبرين إنه ما بدنا نعمل انتخابات، نجدد شرعية الموجودين. انطباعي واللي أكد لي بعض الانتخابات اللي صارت بالجامعات إنه كان بمحله، واللي أكد لي انتخابات نقابية ما كنا منحلم قبل إنه يكون مرشح منه عضو مجلس نقابي ومرشح مش داعمه ولا حزب بيقدر يوصل نقيب محامي مثل ملحم خلف. أكدوا لي إنه من أول نهار أنا كنت عم بقول لهم يا جماعة إذا اليوم ما بنربح ما بعمرنا بنربح، ما تخافوا من انتخابات نيابية مبكرة. هذا الشيء الوحيد اللي ممكن يغير وجه البلد. بلبنان دينا ببلش التغيير من مجلس النواب، وما حدا يقول لي غير هيك. اللي بياخد أكترية نيابية أو اللي بيفوت بكتلة وازنة بيسيطر على كتير من المسائل وبيقدر يقول لك إنه صار في شيء مختلف. أحد الأسباب اليوم إنه الثورة بعد بيطلع ايه شو عملت وشو حققت، كيف بدها تعمل وتحقق بلا صندوق اقتراع، كيف بدها تعمل وتحقق بلا قرار، كيف بدها تعمل وتحقق هيدي الثوره وقت اللي منا موجوده باي شيء من الديسيجن ميكينج بلبنان. شو بدها تعمل هيدي الثوره؟ الثوره هي ناس بتنزل بتصرخ باعلى صوت، بس هيدي المعارضه بدي افترض اللي هي الثورة نزلت على كل عناوين اللي كنا ترشحنا عليها نحن بال 2018 كلوائح كلنا وطني، كنا 66 مرشح. وقتها كانت دينا الأمور بعدها ماشي الحال نوعا ما، البونزي كان ماشي، في ناس حاطين يمكن $100,000 $75,000 بالبنك عم بياخدوا فوايد، عم بيقدروا نوعا ما يدبروا أمورهم. أكيد كنا عم نقول إنه لا الأمور مش ماشية والبلد ما في شيء صح ومش هيك بتكون الأشياء، بس نوعا ما كانت بعدها من بعد الوضع مقبول. اللي صار هو هذا الانهيار اللي بعدنا يمكن بأوله بعد ما شفنا وين بيوصل هذا الانهيار، لأن حتى لحد اليوم ناس بعدها مش عم تدفع ديون اللي عليها. هنالك تعليق مهال، ما حدا عم يدفع ضرائب كمان، يعني بعدها نوعا ما الأمور مقبولة. رغم ذلك بقول لك إنه ما في شيء سستينبل. حنوصل لمحل وين كل شيء بالبلد للأسف أكيد ما في غير بأدائهم إنه نوصل لأنه كل شيء يصير فارغ. شوفي كيف ما بيقدروا يشكلوا حكومة، هن مافيا بين بعض بيتناتشوا الحصص وما فين يشكلوا حكومة. فلا ما في مجال بلبنان إلا إنه يجي فجر لهذه المعارضة تقدر تقول للناس أنا عم بقدم لكم خيار بديل يقوم على عدالة اجتماعية، على وطن أفضل، على نبذ للمذهبية والطائفية والعنصرية والتفرقة. نحن شعب واحد بدنا نبني بلد مع بعض، بلد فينا نعيش فيه بكرامة وبحرية. ونحن بدنا نجيب public servants مثل ما أنا اعتبرت حالي من أول يوم خادمة عامة لهذه للناس اللي انتخبوني ولكل اللبنانيين، لقال لهم إنه أنتم فيكم تغيروني بأي نهار أدائي مش جيد. أنا بستقيل إذا بتطالبوني بالاستقالة، وهيدا اللي عملته. أنا بخضع للناس مش بمشي الناس على ذوقي، وكل يوم بغير وبقول لهم غيرت من أجلكم وبضحك عليهم وقت اللي ما عم بيشوفوا ولا نتيجة. وأهم شيء ما بستمر بمنصب أو بسلطة وقت اللي أنا مني قادرة أعمل تغيير ومني قادرة هز هيكل الفساد وهيكل السلطة. فاليوم الفرز صار كتير واضح مين معارضة عن جد، ومين إلى جانب الناس وإلى جانب أهله، ومين قاعد مكمش شو بده يعمل هو حلفائه، مين بده يسير رئيس بري بركي ما بعرف شو بيعمل، ومين بده يشوف مين بيعمل كالكوليشنز وحسابات ضيقة لمصالحه ولبقائه. بعتقد صار هيدا كتير الفرز أوضح. كل ما عم تسقط أقنعة أكثر، كل ما عم نقرب باتجاه الناس تعرف أكثر كيف بدها تختار. لأنه إذا بتعتقد بالانتخابات الأمريكية ممكن يكونوا ضللوا الناس، التضليل بلبنان ضربيه بعشرات المرات، لأنه الوضع المذهبي والطائفي والتقسيم اللي عاملينه. أنت عندك دولتك وجمهورك وجماعتك وخطابك وشو بتخبرون والناريتيف تبعك، وأنا عندي جماعتي، وكل واحد عامل بكب المسؤولية على الثاني وحاطط زعيمه قديس. فهيدا كله بلبنان وصل لمحل وصلنا إلى نهاية كل هذه اللعبة. كل هيدا ما عاد يبيع وقت الناس ما عاد معها لا تبعت أولادها على المدرسة ولا تاكل ولا تفكر بمستقبل. وقت الأرضنا اللي هي كانت جنة كل عمرها حولوها لجهنم لمزبلة. هول جماعة رايحين إلى مزبلة التاريخ. فبقول لك لازم الناس تطول بالها شوي وتعرف إنه هي الثورة. مش أوقات على الطريق بيقولوا لي شو وين الثورة؟ بقول لهم أنتوا وين؟ أنا شو فيي أعمل إذا الناس اليوم قررت إنه بكل ما حدا يجي يقول لها أعطينا فرصة تعطي فرصة. ناسنا تعبانة وناسنا مقهورة وناسنا ما انترك شيء ما تمارس عليها. فما فينا نضل كمان نلوم الناس اللي نزلت على الشارع واللي طلعت من الشارع، لأن كل اللي تمارس بالشارع سبق وقلناه من ترهيب ومن اندساس ومن عنف ومن كل ذلك. أضف إليه أنه نحن عندنا صناديق اقتراع يا دينا. وقت يكون عندك صندوق اقتراع ليش بدك تنزلي تكسري وتعملي عنف بالشارع؟ ما أنت بتعملي عنف بالشارع وقت يكون عندك ديكتاتور مش قابل يعمل انتخابات نزيهة وحرة. لما عندك صناديق ما لك حق اصلا الا الطالبه بالصناديق. واذا الناس قررت بانتخابات مبكره او غير مبكره، انا انتخابات بوقتها بعتقد ما حيعملوا. عم طالب بمبكره بركي بيعملوا بوقتها ب 2022. بس بدي اقول لك انه شو بتطالبي بديمقراطيه؟ اذا قرر اللبناني اي لبناني اللي كان انه بده يبقى مع هيدي المجموعه، انا مجبوره على رقبتي اقول له انه هيدا خيارك بحترمه، لانه هيدي هي الديمقراطيه. ولازم روح شوف شو لازم اعمل اكثر للتوعيه للمشروع السياسي اللي عند الاصلاح، لاقنعه اكثر انه نحن بنستحق هذه الثقه. بيكون هيدا واجب علي اشتغله، مش ما اقبل النتيجه او مش ما ارضى بنتائج الصناديق. فكل هول المجموعات اللي بيقولوا انه نحن اليوم ناخذ بركه 4-5 نواب شو بتفرق او 10 أو 20، انا رايي لحد اليوم مش صحيح. والدليل احضروا شوفوا انتخابات الايوبيل بعد ما صارت، شوفوا انتخابات اليو اس جي، شوفوا انتخابات جامعه رفيق الحريري اللي بتاريخها يعني اخذت 5 مستقلين هالمره ما بصايره ولا مره. شوفوا انتخابات الايوب، كل الاحزاب صبت مع الاحزاب وقدروا ينتزعوا كل المقاعد اللي ترشحوا عليه. لو ترشحوا على مقاعد اكثر بعتقد كانوا فضحوا اكثر احزاب السلطه والتركيبه. وضعنا مش سهل ابدا. رح يضل في ناس يعملوا معارضين ويسموا حالهم معارضه. اصلا كانوا وزراء موجودين بحكومات ويسموا حالهم معارضه، هن وزراء بيتكلوا انه الناس ما بتعرف المفاهيم الديمقراطيه كما يجب او منا فايته بالتفاصيل. في يقول له انا وزير وانا معارض بنفس الوقت. هيدي ما في ولا ديمقراطيه بالعالم بتصير. وزير هو جزء من سياسه الحكومه، مش انه هو بدير ملف معين وما خصه بالباقي. الناس كيف بدها تعرف وين الخط الفاصل ما بين المعارضه والموالاه؟ كيف بتعرف؟ اجت فرصه كمان الاستقاله اللي هي مفروض لو تستقال معنا عدد اكبر مفروض انه كانوا ينحشروا يعملوا انتخابات نيابيه. للاسف التدخلات معهم السياسيه خلتهم ما يستقيلوا، يبقوا على قرارهم بالبقاء ضمن بوتقه المافيا، وانه هالكم واحد بنعمل عليهم حمله انه استقالتهم بلا طعمه وغير مجديه. لك بقائكم شو؟ بقائكم شو؟ قاعدين بمدرسه بالصف لا بتصوتوا تصويت صح ولا بتنفذوا شيء لا من النظام الداخلي ولا من القوانين ولا من الدستور. هيدي السلطه كل يوم بتدعوس الدستور والقوانين والانظمه كلها. بقى وهون فيك تحط بسهوله البرلمان مع السلطه. عفوا وسام
بس كنت بدي اقول انه ما ننسى انه هون حتى بامريكا اللي هو طبعا نظام متقدم شوي اكثر، بس حتى هون في ناس بيجربوا يتخطوا على الديمقراطيه. يعني ترامب بحد ذاته ما كان بده يأجل الانتخابات. فالديمقراطيه مطرح ما كان خصوصا بلبنان بيجربوا يتخطوها او بيجربوا يعني بطريقه او باخرى يدعسوا على حقوق المواطن بلبنان. اعتقد سؤالك دينا كان من ناحيه حقوق المواطن. It's so important لانه نحن بلبنان يا ما في معرفه بالنسبه لحقوق المواطن يا هالحقوق ما موجوده. هيدا هو يعني امبارح كنت من بعد ما صاروا الانتخابات رحت تمشيت شوي بواشنطن دي سي وشفت الساينز الارمات تبعول العالم، واكثر شيء بتلاقي ساينز هو we the people. نحن الشعب، نحن المواطنين. والحقوق يعني كل واحدة منهم عم بتنادي حقوق معينة، إن كانت حقوق الأقليات، إن كانت حقوق خلينا نقول التكلم الحر يعني freedom of speech إلى آخره. كل هالحقوق هن بانتخابهم عم ينتخبوا مشانها، ما عم ينتخبوا شخص معين. يعني
صحيح.
أوكي هو هذا مجسد ببايدن، مجسد بهاريس، بس مش عم ينتخبوا هن بس شخص، عم ينتخبوا فكرة وعم ينتخبوا بروجرام. يعني بولا مثلا منشن الانفايرمنت، البيئة. طب ما البيئة شيء للمستقبل، شيء للحاضر وللمستقبل. فهن اللي انتخبوا لهالشيء بينتخبوا لشيء عم بيشارطوا للمستقبل. نفس الشيء بلبنان، يعني إذا بدهم هن يشارطوا للماضي وصار انتخابات إن كان مبكرة أو على الوقت، بدهم ينتخبوا للماضي يتفضلوا ينتخبوا للماضي. إذا بدهم ينتخبوا للمستقبل حيكون عندهم بروجرامات بالثورة من الثورة اللي هي بروجرامات غير. واحدة من هالبروجرامات هي حقوق المواطن، البيل اوف رايتس. نحن إذا بلبنان عندنا دستور عم بيستغلوه فئة معينة وما في حقوق للمواطن اللبناني، هون بأمريكا من 250 سنة طلعوا دستور وبعدها بسنة ونص نفس اللي كتب الدستور كتب حقوق المواطن اللي هو اسمه جيمس ماديسون، ووحده ضد الثاني، وحده بتعمل بالانس للثاني. نحن اليوم عندنا دستور وعم بيستغلوه، بعتقد بولا اكثر من اي حدا فيها تقول، لانه عم بيستغلوا الدستور ليلا نهارا، هن اللي بالمؤسسات يا ما عم بيطبقوه يا عم بيستغلوه يا بيزيدوا عليه يا ما. فما في عندك شيء من المواطن عم بيقدر يحمي هالمواطن من كل الحقوق اللي بتقدر تسترده. فهن عطوا حقوقهم خلينا نقول in good faith للدوله، هلا صار وقت يبلشوا يستردوها. بهنيها لبولا ولكل الشغل اللي عم تعملها، وبتمنى انه اول ما يصير الانتخابات باسرع وقت ممكن هيدي تكون واحدة من المطالبات اللي يطالبها المواطن اللبناني، يطالبوا بيل اوف رايتس او حقوق للمواطن اللي بتأمن لهم حقوقهم، بتكرس لهم اياها او بتجيب لهم حقوق ما عندهم اياها. والمرأة اول واحدة منهم. يعني مش وارده اليوم انه المرأة بلبنان، مش وارده المرأة بلبنان اليوم ما بتقدر تجنز اولادها. انا اختي كانت مجا الله يرحمها كانت متجوزه اجنبي، كان ما بتقدر تعطي اولادها الجنسيه اللبنانيه. ما بيخطر، اتس انكونسيفبل لإلي انه كيف يعني انه اولاد اختي ما يكونوا
وغير دستوري وسام، وغير دستوري بشكل كامل،
بشكل يا بيتخفض يا بيكسر. صار وقت يكون عندنا حقوق، اذا عن جد بدنا حقوق المواطن تكون كلير. حقوق المرأة، الحقوق البيئية، كل الحقوق الموجودة، الحقوق السياسية، الانتخاب، المواطن بحق له ينتخب. نحن هون المواطنين غيروا نظام على بكرة أبوه against all effort. طب ليش نحن بلبنان أنا تركت من أبصر كم سنة ولهلا بعدها بشي 30 سنة وبعدهم نفس الأشخاص؟ لأنه المواطن ما بيقدر، ما عنده قدرة تغيير النظام. هون بيقدروا يغيروا النظام.
لأن ما عندك مواطن بعد وسام. أنا تعذروني Jim, I'm so sorry. I really have to apologize to you. Also, we spoke in Arabic all this time. Sorry, I have to leave you. I hope that we can hear you next time. And I'm gonna watch your interview, and I'm sure you have a lot of things to say. I'm one of your fans and journalists. And بدي اقول لك ثانك يو وسام. بس بدي زيد شغله صغيره، انه هول عم نحكي انا وياك على قوانين ودينا وطارق، بس هول مشغلين الله عندهم كل واحد على حسابه، بدك اياهم ما يخالفوا كل قوانين وشو ما بدهم. على كل حال بعتقد صاروا كثير مكشوفين. انا بشكركم. انا بشكرك. بدي ادعي دينا وبدي اشكركم وبدي ادعيكم جميعا كمان انه نوحد الجهود، نلتقي مع بعض. انا القرار بعتقد ما في، نحن تحالف وطني وانا القرار بعتقد ما بنختلف عن بعض ولا شيء. بسمعهم وبشوف شو بيعملوا، شغل كثير حلو خاصه على سايد كوميونيكيشن. لازم كمان نحن نوحد البراندز خلينا نقول اللي بنطل فيها على الناس لنكسب ثقه اكبر. وشكرا لك طارق على هالجمعه الحلوه خليني اقول، وعلى هالانترفيو الحلو. بدي تعذروني، انا سبق وبلغت اني مضطره امشي على كمان زوم ميتينج، وبشكركم كثير.
ثانك يو.
تحياتي ثورة تي في الأولى اللي بلشت، أول حدا طارق عمل ثورة تي في.
ثانك يو بولا في السبورت.
ثانك يو، ميرسي كثير. أقل شيء وأقل واجب. ثانك يو سو ماتش. ثانكس. باي.
So back to English now. Sorry, Paul. Sorry, Paul. Sorry, Jim.
I could hear the passion and I could hear the points. My Arabic is awful, but it's not non-existent entirely.
But you lived in Beirut for a while, didn't you?
A couple of years there during the Civil War,
Amazing.
82, 83, 84.
Yeah, that was quite a time back then.
It was.
Yeah. Well, Dina, I think, has some really interesting questions now for you, and it'll be in English. So I think it'll be a little bit easier for you to communicate.
Now we move to English. Jim, I'd like to ask you, what do you think was the underlying story of the US elections? And do you think they are over?
Well, they're all over but the shouting. Let me put it that way. There's going to be, as you know, recounts, and there's going to be a lot of talk about legal cases. But, you know, the efforts by the Trump administration to raise money to fight the legal fight and protest that they were not treated fairly and that there was corruption involved, it's all just to raise money. They've said it up front, 50% of that money goes to retire some of his campaign debts, including Donald Trump Jr.'s girlfriend's $80,000 a year salary working on the campaign. So that's going to go on. The bottom line, though, is that for the past 4 years, I think a lot of Americans have been pointing a finger at Donald Trump and saying, there's the racism, we don't want that. They've been saying, there's the misogyny, we don't want that. They've been saying, you know, these are the excesses and we don't want that. But you can't put it all off on Donald Trump. He got 70 million votes to Biden's 74 million, all right? Pretty close. It's us. We've never come to grips with our racism. We haven't come to grips in many cases with our misogyny. You know, there are so many things that we put off on our politicians. And I think there's a lesson here too in Lebanon. We put it all off on the politicians and we blame them. But at the end of the day, we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, is it really about us? Are we the ones that have to change?
Yes, this is very much. Are we the ones that have to change? And I think, yes, it's all about us. And here in Lebanon, I think we should all know that nobody will help us if we don't help ourselves. Another question I have a question for you, Wissam. Shall I take it or shall I stay with Jim?
It's up to you. Jim.
Just share it up.
Yeah, we will share like this. Wissam, you have published books about democracy in the region. What are key learnings that you can draw from this election and especially to the Lebanese revolution?
Well, I think the biggest key learning for me is the empowerment of citizens. I mean, citizens can make change if they really set their minds to it, but it's a lot of hard work. And, you know, democracy is something that is not easy and it requires constant hard work. Some people think democracy is just, you know, a ballot, and it's, you know, the ballot is the end result. But to get to that point, there's a whole host of systems that, in a way, are in place, and a lot of good people working towards it. And I was having a chat a couple of days ago with a friend of mine, and to me, it seemed like the best way I could describe it is democracy, a well-functioning democracy is almost like a train. And you have a lot of wagons in that train, and each wagon represents maybe constituencies. In a federal system, it might be states, it might be, you know, media, it might be a lot of different type of, you know, kind of elements of this system. And a well-functioning democracy's train is always moving forward. And some people are going to try and sway it, and some people are going to try and stop it. But, you know, it has to keep on moving forward. But it will face some risks. And I think the key learning for Lebanon is that its democracy has been swayed multiple times. There are some serious institutional problems in Lebanon that have to be attended to. And I think, you know, if you want to compare a system like Lebanon to a system like, you know, like the US, as unfair as that might sound, because one has had a whole couple of centuries, you know, more in practice, etc. You could make the argument that, you know what, just like the US suffered its own on its own with its own civil wars and its own problems, etc. So is Lebanon suffering now. But if it keeps moving that train forward, and if it keeps, kind of pushing towards positive change, and if it empowers people, then I think this is one of the key learnings. Another quick one I'll mention is that this election also and maybe extending a little bit to what Jim said a couple of minutes ago, was also a lot about minorities or perceived minorities, or even people, that were being somewhat, somewhat to say it kindly, mistreated throughout, the past 4 years. You had, minorities voting, you had, Black Americans voting, you had Latinos voting, so you had a huge amount of people voting. And I think one of the biggest and most encouraging things out of this election is we might end up getting something like 150, 160 million votes by some estimates. If that happens, that's what democracy is all about. And I think in Lebanon, if Lebanon is allowed to vote one way or another, right, whatever the outcome is, that in and of itself is also something that, would be a huge win. So those are some very kind of quick learnings that I would get from this specific election.
Thank you, Wissam. I have one question for you, and I'm curious. I know you live in Washington, D.C., and we saw on TV many scenes of jubilation. Did you have a chance to go downtown? What was your impression?
Yeah, I went downtown yesterday. I went with my wife, and we walked around the streets and close to the White House, and in some spots that have become famous, like the church where President Trump held up the Bible and things like this. And it was people dancing on the streets. Interestingly, you also saw some isolated people who were Trump supporters standing on the sideline and holding up their signs. And in general, it was very peaceful. This is actually something that I voted in the U.S. For the past, since I became an immigrant here, and I voted in Lebanon. And there is that sense of peace, inner peace that you get after a vote, right? And I think there was a huge sigh of relief globally, let's say. But there is also a sense of peace even for those who may not have won, at least most of them. There are some that are going to complain and do all that kind of stuff, and Jim alluded to that a little bit. But there is a sense of peace once you place that vote and you walk out. And I sense that. I live in Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., and Virginia primarily voted for Biden. It was almost a 10-point spread. But you didn't see any incidents. You didn't see any mistreatments. And I think overall, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, for almost 160 million people voting, and you've been all over the world covering this, the amount of incidents that were reported were almost, negligible, if any.
Yes, and we had been warned, that don't go out after the vote is being counted. And this came through corporations, and it came through other security sources, very quietly telling people in affluent positions in the United States, be careful. And this is what led them to be boarding up windows in Washington, New York City, and other places, because they were warning everybody. But that was the Department of Fear. They were trying to churn the Portland demonstrations into a nationwide race riot, if you will, after Trump won re-election. It didn't happen. And we still get this kind of pressure. But you're absolutely right, Wissam. One of the smoothest elections I've ever seen, but the turnout was amazing, incredible.
Yes.
Excuse me, get all carried away when I think about standing in that line with my daughter to cast the ballots and get that sense of peace, that very sense of peace that you talked to. Although I don't know if I would have had it if Trump had won.
Yeah, it might have felt a little bit differently, but I don't know. Once I go into that high school and you cast the vote and you walk out, and some people want to cast doubt, etc. And one of the election officials there, he saw me there and kind of walked up to me and said, would you like, that was really interesting. So would you like to learn more about this machine? And I said, yeah, I'd love to learn more about this machine because it's a machine. And he started explaining to me how each machine, at least in Virginia, I'm not sure if it's the same thing around the US or in Georgia, has 4 different outputs. And he started explaining to me how all of these four kind of go in their own way, and then they all have to reconcile at some point. And if there isn't any reconciliation, then there are some issues, etc. So it's this comfort of having a fellow citizen explain to me the details of the election and how my vote and my family's vote is actually going to count. That adds to that kind of comfort. So the educational process from a positive perspective, but there was a lot of fear mongering, as Jim just explained. In DC, there were boarded up restaurants and boarded up around close to the White House, and ended up meaning nothing. It ended up basically people just cast their vote and walked away.
And it was incredibly heavy voting. It was, I've never seen a turnout like this. And I was so encouraged to see a little old lady brought in by her caregiver, in a wheelchair and wheeled up to the front of the line. She got in. So I thought to myself, next year I get a wheelchair, because I waited in line for 90 minutes with my daughter. And it was a long time, but it wasn't that long. Some people in this election had waited 7-8 hours in order to cast their ballots, especially in the primaries. But it was a good experience overall, a rewarding experience overall. And I am glad that it went off without any type of violence, really, nothing significant at all. And I think that the American people really showed that when they care, they come out. Because, our usual number of voters is somewhere between 40 and 50%. And I was told, since I was that high, that that's nothing, but it shows how satisfied people are with their candidates. I think those days are gone. We had Lindsey Graham on television today saying that unless they change the election laws, the GOP, the Republicans will never win the White House again. Now, this is the kind of attitude, I think, in GOP politics that doesn't grasp the fundamentals. No, it doesn't mean they'll never win the White House again. It means that unless the GOP changes, not the election laws, not the voting, change the GOP, then you can win the White House. Democrats have the same lesson to learn. AOC, everybody's darling, one of the squad, as we call them, the four women who have, literally changed the way young Americans look at politics. She's been castigating the Democratic Party, saying, look, progressives who ran on healthcare, who ran on a Green New Deal, won every single race. Can you say the same thing? And no, the Democratic Party lost seats in Congress. There was ample evidence that people voted against President Trump and against Democratic candidates for Congress or the Senate.
Yep.
That's right.
Jim, this election has surprised many around the world with a drastic shift from right to left. What do you think will be the top US policies that the Biden administration will be focused on going forward?
Well, we've already heard it, and I don't want to get out over my skis here. There's all kinds of speculation in the media right now about what he's going to do in the Middle East and all of these other things. I think the Iran case, it'll be reconsidered, but it's not the priority that coronavirus is. Biden knows he's got to get coronavirus under control in order to regain the economy. And, that matters. That matters to the tourism industry around the world. That matters to the travel and tour groups in the United States. This is a traveling world. It matters to the airlines. It matters to everything American. It really does. And so he knows he has to get that job tackled, number one. He is also, I think, he has proved himself, as I think that we already heard here. He proved that his first presidential act, picking his vice president, he picked a woman, and he picked a woman of color. And I think that telegraphs a message to everyone, or it should, that women are going to rank high, and women's rights are going to rank high among his priorities. I don't think he's going to jump into any conflicts. I do wonder what the relationship will be with Saudi Arabia. I wonder what kind of a different response he might have on the killing of a journalist. You know, all of those things are the particulars, and we wish we had that crystal ball to predict. But I don't think we could put that kind of a jacket on Joe Biden and send him out there. You talked about this dramatic shift from left to right. It wasn't such a dramatic shift from left to right. It was a shift from arrogant, repugnant, self-aggrandizing politics and, you know, populism to decency. That's what it was. And that's what Americans voted for.
Yeah, and I would add to this, I think from a Middle Eastern perspective, Dina, we have to remember specifically within a Lebanese context, let's put it within a Lebanese context, that the bureaucracy itself, I mean, you could have an administrative change, but the bureaucracy generally stays the same. And so a lot of these bureaucrats within the State Departments are going to remain the same. And the policies are in place, and some of them will continue generally following the same guidelines, even though maybe some, you know, at a much higher level, some such as Iran or even the Russia or the China, you know, relationships, those might change. But overall, you know, if you look at a country as small as Lebanon, typically it's the bureaucrats that run these policies. And so the Lebanese shouldn't expect too many changes there. And so I would definitely agree with Jim on that. There is one thing that I think did, you know, the American people did, you know, send a message to the world. And this also applies in the Middle East, which is that the populist wave is, I don't want to say it's over, but the populist wave is basically has been kind of abruptly stopped. From Brazil to some of the Eastern European countries to, you know, that kind of populist rhetoric that, you know, Jim alluded to as being, you know, kind of nationalistic and ugly and poignant and all that kind of stuff, that's going to stop. So the you know, diplomacy is going to restart. And diplomacy along the lines of the traditional approach, which is, I think, what the American people voted for. It's a little bit more tradition. I mean, this guy, Biden, has been in the US for almost 50 years and for 40 some years, right? He's been in politics. So by no means is he coming in with an Obama-esque, let's say, approach to things. Of course, he was the VP of Obama. But still, he's you know, he's a traditionalist. But that's what the American people needed after a Trump. They needed something that goes back to a traditional approach of handling issues, you know, science-based, fact-based, truth-based, those kinds of things. Now, what can we learn about this in the Middle East? What it means is that some of the free reign of some of the autocrats is going to have to come to a stop. You can't go up and chop people up and not expect there to be repercussions. There's going to have to be some form of a repercussion. You know, some of the rhetoric coming out from areas that, for example, were benefiting from a very hardline approach to international policy, even within the Israeli sphere, etc. That's going to also have to change. These calculations will have to change. And so the Lebanese themselves need to take that into account.
I think what Americans want is an end to that transactional politics where be my buddy, say nice things about me, and I'll do that $150 million arms deal. Or give $5 million to my inauguration committee, and I'll move the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that's what it was, remember. It was $5 million in donations coming from Shell Adelson that moved the embassy. And of course, Shell got to go to the ceremony. The Palestinians, though, need to look at a message. This might be their last best chance. And they have to do a lot on their own, just as we've been talking about, you know, the Lebanese doing it on their own. And I think that's a solid message. But the Palestinians have to do it on their own, too. I mean, what was the whole 10 years for your next election? Come on. You know, you've got to do something to build your own democracy. Don't turn peacemaking into a business where you're collecting money and just standing there and it's going into your coffers every year, year after year. You have to think creatively and democratically so that you can build your own nation state. I think Lebanon, you know, obviously it doesn't have the same obstacles as the Palestinians do, but it has plenty of obstacles. You know, it has plenty of obstacles in the way that the government is formed, in the way that people have traditionally voted. Minds need to change. Minds need to get engaged. Maybe there need to be new parties. I don't know. You know that far better than I do. But the lesson that we're getting in the United States is We need to change our political parties. At the same time, we need to engage with them. We have to be a part of them. We have to participate in our democracy. Because if it's going to be a government by the people and for the people and of the people better show up.
Yes.
Well, an interesting lesson that happens is if they don't show up, make them show up, which is, you know, in some states, there were some, you know, some people looked at that as something of, you know, of a new procedure, which is you send people the ballots so that they do vote. Now that's a common practice in some states, in other states it's not. And in the US you vote on a state-by-state basis. But that practice in and of itself is really interesting because essentially you're saying to a citizen in some way or another, listen, you know, you have all of these rights, but you also have some responsibilities, and one of them is voting, and you got to vote. So when you get 160 million people voting, or 5 million in Lebanon, or, you know, wherever, right? You're placing the burden of responsibility of being a citizen on the citizen, and that's how it should be. The citizen has to be responsible for their own decisions. Yes, they might be busy. Yes, they might need to take the kids to soccer practice on voting day. But guess what? These are momentous times, and change is always happening. And if these people don't participate, it's a problem.
I think what we've learned is mail-in ballots and early voting. We had 2 weeks during which we could go any day, anytime, and cast our ballots. For me, that worked because I'm casting that ballot in person. I don't have to worry about, you know, Trump put a new postmaster general in there that slowed the whole operation down. This was a president who put, you know, a Raytheon defense contractor's lobbyist in charge of the Department of Defense. We have an oil gas lobbyist in charge of the Department of Energy. You know, the lobbyists got everything they wanted. There was nothing they could dream of that they didn't get under the Trump administration. That has to change. We have to have leaders in cabinet level positions that are different. The same goes for Lebanon as well. When you have business so closely tied to politics, you have problems. We have the much bigger problem of money in our politics. We have way too much money in our politics. They're going to hold the Senate runoff races in the state of Georgia, and I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be spent in the next 2 months. And here's the rub, people, here's the rub. Everybody's already made up their mind. There isn't a political ad you can run that will change anybody's minds about this. It's all going to be about voter turnout.
Yeah, and there's one thing here that I just want to reiterate, Dina, which is the innovation in democracy is really important. These small things, because democracy, like I said at the beginning, is extremely hard. Small things sometimes make big differences. Imagine if I had told you, you know, 4 or 5 months ago, if you open up ballots, you know, send ballots by mail, which probably would not have had, this is accidental. This was an accidental experiment in democracy in a place like the US. Because if there had not been COVID, I don't think that mail-in ballots would have made such a big difference. So this was a kind of quasi-experiment. And what happened is you had COVID, so people had to react, and election officials said, people aren't going to come to the voting booth, and we don't want them to because everybody's going to get sick. So this experiment shows how with a little bit of tweaking in democracy, you can have massive effects. So this is another lesson for Lebanon in this case, or the region, which is sometimes if slight tweaks can make big changes in how people participate in their democracies. So don't underestimate that. The second quick note I would say is how much hard work went into this. A lot of people worked really, really, really hard from both parties, right? Nothing came in on a silver platter, nothing. It was really hard work. So if people within the revolution in Lebanon or other places really want to cause change, they have to work hard. It takes a lot, but it can be done.
Let's try to let Dina Sue get a word in edgewise.
Yes, but by the way, I had a question, but indirectly you answered this question. It was, what would you say? would you say what happened in the US in the past week is a democratic revolution? And do you agree with those in the US who like to say that the American Revolution is ongoing? You said it indirectly. Yes, it is ongoing.
And we have to protect it. You know, I had the real sense when I woke up Saturday and I heard the news, I had the real sense that we had pulled back our democracy by the very, you know, edge of its collar and brought it back to safety, because I had the feeling that it was headed off the ledge.
Yeah, yeah. So my question to you now, before this election, Jim, very few people understood the crucial role of the media in announcing the results. What did you think of CNN's coverage and announcement? And do you think this media role should be maintained given some media outlets can be influenced?
Oh, you know, I have mixed feelings about this. When we talk about the media and elections, specifically in the United States, we have 3 24-hour-a-day news networks. And if in the last 3 months, you watched all 3 of them 24 hours a day, you wouldn't have a clue what was going on in the world. And the reason is because all they covered was politics. And they covered it, CNN and MSNBC, even more so, covered it from a Democratic perspective. Many more Democratic guests than GOP guests. Fox News exclusively the conspiracy theories, the Trump rallies, all the things they could do to highlight the president. It was very polarized. It has become more and more polarized. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think Americans being ignorant of what's going on in the world is healthy. Believe me, they get no news about what's going on in the world. None. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to this, I would add the following, which is when it comes to media, there's a reason why the media does it. It's because there's nobody else who can do it. Because the states, you know, voting happens at the state level. And so you don't have a federal body that can say, okay, the election is over. Actually, the federal body is out of it until they meet for, you know, as the electorate to say, okay, this is what the popular vote is. And now we're going to pass on, pass it on into the electorate, and therefore this is the president. In the meantime, the let's say the institution, if you will, that claims or states that this is the president based on all of these metrics, et cetera, is the media, right? The problem.
Well, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be
a long time
state election officials. But the problem is that in Georgia, they put it up there. It's still there, too close to call. 1/4 of a percentage point. I think it may have moved up to 0.3 of a percentage point now. But you know, the fact of the matter is, it was so razor thin everywhere that the state officials were reluctant to call it, and some of the news networks were as well.
Yeah, the one thing with respect to media that does have me more concerned than the regular airwaves, which although there are concerns there, as Jim pointed to, is the social media. And it's because I am a technologist. I mean, I see how social media tends to, separate people, where, you know, the algorithms in technology, if you see something that you like, it's going to send you more of that stuff. And so it's going to tend to take the people who are more conservative further out to the right, and the people who are more liberal further out to the left. And I think this is something with social media that is a major, major concern. And I don't think, I think it's also happening in our region, because the people I talk to in Lebanon as well, they have these very set in their ways. And it's very hard to have a political conversation, which is the entire purpose of politics to begin with, within a democracy, where you can find, that overlay, or at least that, kind of an area where of common grounds.
I spend most of my day on Twitter when I'm there. And I can tell you that Twitter, it's just, you don't want that argument on Twitter, because it's an exchange of insults. And there's no benefit to that. There's no political discussion there. I would be very happy to see the US outlaw political ads, and every television station has to give out free airtime to hold debates, to hold town halls, to ask the citizens about what concerns them and make the candidates reply and give their views. I think we go to prepackaged stuff and we rely on social media way too much. We need to get back to that kind of a town hall where people, as you say, really discuss the issues. That's what politics was all about when the idea of democracy was born in Greece.
Yes, yes, we need to give the space for them to express themselves again. We need to hear, to listen. At the end of the day, we need to serve the people. So back to you, Wissam, and back to Lebanon. You were one of the drafters and proponents of Lebanon Bill of Rights. How is this relevant when it comes to elections?
Well, I mean, the whole point of elections is to provide people what they want. And you're providing it based on, let's say, a set of rules. And that set of rules is usually constitutional. And so a Bill of Rights helps establish these rules and rights, right? And so when I went down to DC just a couple of days ago, or yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, most of the signs were about rights. You know, I want my rights back. I want this back. I want this back. It's people felt that what is theirs was taken away from them during this administration. That's essentially the purpose of having a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, you know, the Constitution gave the right to establish government. The Bill of Rights took back some of these potential, I guess, abuses and gave it back to the citizen. They're firmly in the hands of the citizens. I think in the Arab world and in Lebanon specifically, the notion of a Bill of Rights is almost non-existent. And I think, you know, when together with others, we drafted the Bill of Rights, the whole purpose of it was, you know, the Constitution is great. And the Human Declaration the UN Declaration of Human Rights is also great. But you need something localized to the context. And we can't use the US Bill of Rights because that's US specific. We can't, the UN, UN Declaration of Human Rights is too global. China has its Bill of Rights, right? South Africa has its Bill of Rights. The European Union has its Bill of Rights. And so we felt that because of the constitutional excesses in Lebanon, there's a very important case to be made for a Bill of Rights. Now, how does it relate to this election specifically? The way that it relates to this election or any election essentially is it's a rewind or a reset of people to say, wait a minute, we would like to go back and, essentially provide a revision, not necessarily of our rights, but who's helping implement these rights. So we don't want person A, we want person B, person C, person D. And that's what it's about. Ultimately, faces are going to come and go. But these institutions and the Constitution and Bills of Rights and all of these instruments that are available will stay. That's a huge thing in the US. Unfortunately, in Lebanon, you have a lot of the same faces over and over again, and the Constitution gets beaten up day and night. It's not supposed to be like that. People should be, sorry to say, politicians should be beaten up by the electorate, and the institution, the Constitution, should remain the same. So that's why it's very relevant, more relevant than any other instrument today. You're on mute, Dina. You're on mute.
Sorry. You have been working with the Lebanese revolution, Wissam, from day one. Why do you think change has not come yet? And do you agree when people say that the Lebanese revolution has failed?
Why has change not come? Because in a democracy, the process is hard, and sometimes it takes time. And so in the case of Lebanon, our democracy is only about 43, so about 75 years old now. And sometimes you need more time, and you need more experiments and failures. Who was it that said that? Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Churchill who said democracy is the worst form of governance except for all others, or something of the sort.
You got it right.
Yeah, so something of the sort. Anyway, so the whole point of democracy is that it's, again, I hate to say it again, is that it's something that takes a lot of effort. And so when we're talking about, within the context of the revolution, The Lebanese revolution is only, is literally a year old. And we do have a constitution. So if you want to change the constitution, there's only two ways to do it. You either do it institutionally or you do it through violence. One of the things I most admire about the Lebanese today is that there is an overall tendency not to want more violence, which coming from Lebanon might seem rather awkward to somebody not from Lebanon, right? Because there's always been violence, a violent way to resolve issues. So then you're left with the institutional way. And the institutional way is to do it through what Paula was mentioning a few minutes ago, which is through parliament, through elections, etc. So that's going to take time. But do I think that the revolution has failed in the meantime? I think anybody who reaches that conclusion doesn't really understand revolutions. If you go back to any one of these revolutions, some of these revolutions have been around for 250 years. And I mentioned that maybe Jim didn't get that part because I was speaking in Arabic, but there's a lot of people in the US that say the revolution in the US revolution is still very much alive today. You can go and ask French people and they'll tell you the French revolution is extremely alive today. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the French were all about fraternité and liberté and all that kind of stuff there because of a certain threat that they felt. So it's almost a continuous thing. So to judge the Lebanese revolution by this year is overly harsh and unnecessary. The other thing that I would say here, and I'll end it with that, is that anybody who asks that question to the revolution, to me, seems a little bit cynical because I can easily say what the revolution has not been able to do. The revolution has not been able to destroy the Lebanese economy. The Lebanese revolution has not been able to destroy half of Beirut. The Lebanese revolution has not been able to create so much unemployment. The Lebanese revolution has not been able to destroy the environment in Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So have we failed at doing all of these things? Yeah, we did fail at all of these things, but the regime that exists sure as hell succeeded, and they've destroyed one heck of a beautiful country. And I think it's a great shame that they be saying this about the revolution when they should be introspecting and seeing all the failures that they've had.
Thank you, Wissam. Back to you, Jim. The American democracy is very different from others around the world, and many, as a result of Trump's unique leadership, believed its best days are behind her. Do you agree with this assessment, and why?
Well, I did on Friday. On Saturday, I changed my mind. 4 more years of Trump, I think, would have been disastrous. We don't, it's not just democracy. We call it the democratic experiment. It's an experiment. We don't know if this is going to work or not. We're just going to keep trying different things until we make it work. But we would rather put, as Wissam was pointing out there, give some well-defined rights to the people and take them away from the politicians and the institutions, and then create some well-defined divisions between the institutions in order that they can hold one another accountable. To create these checks and balances. This is all part of the democratic experiment. And no, I don't think it's dead at all. I am, heartened. I think that it's as healthy as ever. It's in a lot of trouble. It's got a struggle straight ahead, but we've always been up to a challenge. And I think that we can rise to this one as well.
Thank you. Wissam, how will a Biden campaign affect the region generally and Lebanon specifically?
I think we talked about that point a little bit earlier. I think that Biden's priorities, I agree with what Jim said earlier, that Biden's priorities are a little bit different. When it comes to Corona and the economy, that definitely has to be number one. When it comes to foreign policy, I think his relationship, the transatlantic relationship with the Europeans, with NATO, all of this stuff will be built. The Paris Climate Agreement is probably going to be another priority for them, etc. So generally speaking, I think, kind of in the grand scheme of things, Lebanon is pretty low on the priority list. This said, Lebanon does represent an opportunity, and I've always thought about this because, the US foothold in Lebanon is unique in the sense that this is a liberal and multifaceted country with fascinating history. And if the US ever wanted a place to experiment democracy in the region, Lebanon is pretty much one of the best, I guess, type of countries to do it. The problem with Lebanon is that it has issues beyond the U.S. priorities right now. So, the internal economic issues and a lot of the stagnant political operators, etc. And so the Lebanese have to resolve it on their own. I'm sure the U.S. is going to be keen on seeing it, kind of good steps happening. And the US might be nudging every now and then, led by the bureaucracy itself, not necessarily Biden himself at that level. But the Middle Eastern bureaucracy within the State Department, I'm sure, is looking at Lebanon and saying, okay, what can we do here, et cetera, like the border demarcation that they're doing, like the also the gas demarcation that they're doing with Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So those things would probably continue. I don't think those are going to change. In terms of support for Lebanon's economy, the initiative that was led by the French president, I think it's still US policy and likely will continue to be led by the French. I wouldn't be surprised if a Biden administration would sort of kind of partially outsource the nitty-gritty of the Lebanese, kind of negotiations, all that, to Macron. I wouldn't be surprised about that. But we'll have to wait and see. But immediate relief for Lebanon on the economic side, I just don't see it happening right now, to be honest. Not coming, at least not led by the US. But I hope I'm wrong.
Okay, to conclude, my final question, we talked about it, but just to conclude, are you optimistic, Jim and Wissam, for the US and our region?
I'm always optimistic, but I try to be a realist as well. And I think it's a time for us to be relieved. It's a time for us to be hopeful, but it's also a time for us to realize all the work that's got to be done and ask ourselves, what part are we going to play? Yeah. What are we going to do to make it better? Instead of pointing a finger at somebody else and say, well, I want them to do this, or I want them to do that, or I need this, or I need that. We all have to look deep inside ourselves and answer that question, because we're going to get the government we deserve.
Yeah, I would agree with Jim on this. This is more an introspection moment, I think, more than it is something that's outside. Each country needs to look within itself, and Lebanon is one of those that has to do that. Lebanon has to essentially decide what future it wants. Does it want a future that is peaceful and that is, prosperous and happy, and among, the family of nations, or does it want one that continues along the route of continuous conflict, internal and external, with, kind of all the economic issues, and it's a sad state that Lebanon has come to, having been one of the outliers within the Middle East. So I am optimistic in a way, in some counterintuitive way, because I don't know how much worse things can get in Lebanon at this point. But I am also optimistic because the alternatives are right there in front of everybody. So I hope there will be elections in the near future and people can decide for themselves. And if they do make the wrong decision, then they have only themselves to blame. Fortunately, my adopted country, which is the US, I believe made an important decision. It looked inside and it didn't like what it saw. So hopefully my home nation will do that as well, and soon.
Hopefully Lebanon will do that. Hopefully, we hope so.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
I want to ask one more question, please, if I may ask, about the sanctions, about the U.S. sanctions on the politicians. Last question about the politician, the Lebanese politician. We saw some guys from Berry guys get sanctions, and Gibran Bassil get sanctions recently. Do you think this will continue to go to all, or any information or anything you would like to say about that?
I don't have any insight on that. I don't have any insight on that specifically to share with you, but this goes back to the transactional nature of the Trump presidency. And it all depends on who Trump was talking to or Jared Kushner was talking to, or Pompeo was talking to, when they concocted that these sanctions would somehow benefit someone. It's going to have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But the one thing I can say is I don't think you're going to see that kind of transactional politics underneath Biden. I think that it's going to be back to confer, discuss, negotiate with our key allies around the world. And before we make a move, we ask others what effect it might have on them.
The State Department as a administration will stop immediately taking like a vision from the president, or will take time until the Biden administration take over? They will continue following the same policies. And if they have a sanction to go on 20 people, will they stop now, or they will continue?
They continue until the presidential order, if it was a presidential order, until that presidential order is canceled by another executive order, or if they are an indictment, it would continue until the court, the Department of Justice, made a ruling on. And same way with State Department, would reconsider those kinds of sanctions, Treasury Department, economic sanctions. All of these things are directed by the executive branch, but not totally controlled by the executive branch, especially if there's an indictment, say in one of the courts, federal courts in the United States, because a lot of times that's where they pull these from. And if I'm not wrong, I think it was the Southern District of New York that participated in all of that. So, what changes is it's not the way to do business necessarily. People have the idea, it's not Trump. They're saying, today let me put some sanctions on Hezbollah. This is going to really help things out. Yeah, he doesn't. He's too lazy. He's out on the golf course. It's somebody else within the administration that says, say, look, we could tweak them with this one, and then they follow it through. And most presidents will go, what the hell would I do that for? And Donald Trump said, how much money is in it for us or for me? Or what political alliance benefits from that? And that's how all those decisions became more and more common under Trump.
It's certainly a foreign policy instrument that Trump maximized use of sanctions, and because he understands money.
Well, look what he did with Venezuelans. How do you think he won the Cuba vote? Down in how do you win Florida? He won it with the Venezuelan immigrants and with the Cuban immigrants, because he slapped more sanctions on Nicolas Maduro. By the way, Maduro, they've had years of this. Maduro's still there because these, maximum sanctions simply don't work. They build the walls higher around the kingdoms of our enemies. But they got him, Florida, they threw the vote. I mean, that worked. That was transactional. You vote for me and I'll beat up on the guys you don't like.
Yeah, with the Magnitsky Act, it's something that's becomes quite personal. And so will this policy continue to be used by the US going forward? I don't know, but it's certainly one of the sticks that that foreign policy, which due to technology and due to how money flows around the world, and SWIFT as an international wiring service, and all these details that are within the purview of the US. It's certainly something to keep in mind for people who cross, let's say, certain boundaries. So I don't have more to add really, but that's I don't think it'll stop in the short term, unfortunately. But I do agree with what Jim said, which is the Biden administration is going to be much less transactional. It's going to be much more philosophical, much more visionary, and much more carrot than stick.
So you no longer have to own a golf course in your country in order to do good business with the United States. I think that should come as a relief for everybody.
So to Dina, you have anything to say before?
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the session a lot, by the way. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Wissam. Thank you, Tarek, for always being on top of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Great job. Tarek, good to see you. Wissam, as always, you're the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. We love you. Thank you all.